The sound of my daughter's face being struck 3 times in rapid succession is something I will never forget. Not the specific noise itself, though that was horrific enough, but the way it cut through the polite dinner conversation like a knife through silk. Sharp, final, unmistakable. I was sitting at the head of my mahogany dining table, the one Robert and I bought 30 years ago at an estate sale in Vermont, watching Isabel carefully carry the roast beef she'd spent all afternoon preparing. Her hands were steady despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes, and I remember thinking how much she looked like her father in that moment, the same determined set to her jaw when she was trying to make everything perfect. Then Derek's hand came up fast. The first slap caught her left cheek with a crack that made me flinch. The second and third followed so quickly they almost blurred together. The serving platter tilted dangerously in Isabel's hands, beef juices sloshing toward the edge. But somehow she managed to keep hold of it, even as she stumbled sideways. A bright red mark was already blooming across her cheekbone, angry and vivid against her pale skin. I couldn't move. 30 years of facing down hostile witnesses, of staring down CEOs who thought they could intimidate me in boardrooms, of building a $12 million consulting empire from absolutely nothing. And in that moment, I was frozen completely solid in my chair. Then Patricia started clapping. My son-in-law's mother, sitting to my right in the outdated floral dress she'd worn to every family gathering for the past 3 years, brought her wrinkled hands together in slow, deliberate applause. The smile on her face was worse than the slaps themselves, filled with something that looked horribly like satisfaction. "Now you'll behave," Patricia said, her voice carrying that particular tone of smug righteousness that made my stomach turn. She was still clapping, nodding her approval like Derek had just performed some impressive trick rather than committed assault in my dining room. Isabel stood there trembling, silent tears streaming down her face, still holding that damn platter like her life depended on keeping it level. The mark on her cheek was darkening by the second. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at a point somewhere above the sideboard, her breathing shallow and quick. Derek wiped his hand on his napkin. The same napkin I'd chosen from a boutique in Greenwich because they were supposed to be for special occasions. He wiped his hand like he'd touched something dirty. Then he reached for his wine glass and took a long drink, completely calm, as if nothing unusual had just happened. "Sorry about that, Megan," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "But you know how Isabel gets when she's stressed. Sometimes she just needs a little correction to stay focused. Correction." The word hung in the air between us, obscene in its casual cruelty. Patricia was nodding along enthusiastically. "Oh yes, I completely understand. My Harold used to have to keep me in line too, especially when I was being difficult about household matters. It's just how marriage works, dear." She patted my hand like she was comforting me, like I was the one who needed consoling. "Isabel is so lucky to have a strong husband who cares enough to guide her properly." Something clicked inside me. Not a dramatic snapping or breaking, but a cold, clear click, like a lock turning. All the small things I'd noticed over the past 8 months suddenly assembled themselves into a picture I should have seen long ago. Isabel's canceled lunch dates, the long sleeves in summer, the way she jumped when Derek's phone rang, how she'd started questioning every professional decision, second-guessing the talent that had made her one of the most promising young architects in Connecticut, the gradual disappearance of her friends, the nervous habit of checking her phone constantly, then hiding it quickly when anyone came near. My daughter was standing in my dining room, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, with my son-in-law's handprints on her face and tears streaming silently down her cheeks, and his mother was applauding. I stood up. The chair made a soft scraping sound against the hardwood floor. Nobody said anything. Derek was watching me with this calculating expression, probably trying to figure out if I was going to make a scene. Patricia had stopped clapping, but still wore that satisfied smile. Isabel finally looked at me, and the fear in her eyes was worse than anything else that had happened so far. I walked to the sideboard where I'd left my purse, my movements very deliberate and controlled. My hands were steady as I opened my Hermes bag, the black Birkin that Robert gave me for our 20th anniversary, and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. Rebecca Hartwell answered on the second ring. "Megan, is everything all right?" "Rebecca, I need you here right now," I said, my voice perfectly level despite the rage burning in my chest. "And bring authority." There was maybe half a second of silence, and then Rebecca's tone shifted immediately to the crisp, professional voice I'd heard her use in federal court. "I'm on my way. Address? You know where I live. Please hurry." I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the sideboard. Then I turned back to face the table. Derek's expression had changed. The calculation was still there, but now there was confusion mixing with it. "What was that about, Megan? Who did you just call?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I walked to Isabel and gently took the serving platter from her shaking hands, setting it on the table. Up close, I could see that the mark on her face was actually 3 distinct red patches where his fingers had landed. There were older bruises, too, faded yellow-green ones on her jawline that she'd tried to cover with makeup. How had I not seen them before? How had I convinced myself that everything was fine? "Sit down, sweetheart," I said quietly. Isabel's eyes went wide. "Mom, please don't. You don't understand. It's fine. I wasn't paying attention and the roast was getting cold, and Derek has been so stressed about work lately, and I should have been more careful about timing and—" "Sit down," I repeated, more firmly this time. She sat. Derek started to stand up, his face reddening. "Now wait just a minute, Megan. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this is between me and my wife. We don't need you interfering in our marriage." "Sit down, Derek." Something in my voice made him hesitate. I'd used that tone in depositions with hostile witnesses, the one that said there was no negotiation happening here, only consequences being delayed. He sat, but his jaw was tight with anger. Patricia was finally starting to look uncertain. "Really, Megan, I think you're overreacting. All couples have their little disagreements. There's no need to involve outsiders. I'm sure if you just let Derek and Isabel work this out like adults—" "How long has he been hitting her?" I asked, cutting through Patricia's rambling. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the antique clock in the hallway ticking, each second marked with perfect precision. "I don't know what you're talking about," Derek said, but his voice was too controlled now, too careful. "I've never laid a hand on Isabel before tonight, and that was just because she wasn't listening. Sometimes you have to get someone's attention when they're being hysterical." "Hysterical," I repeated flatly. She was serving dinner. She was being careless. The roast was going to spill. I was preventing a mess. The audacity of the lie was almost impressive. If I hadn't witnessed the whole thing, if I didn't have 30 years of experience reading liars in depositions, I might have questioned my own memory. But I'd seen it. The roast had been perfectly stable in her hands until his palm connected with her face. "Rebecca Hartwell is a federal judge," I said, addressing the room in general. "She's also been my closest friend for 20 years. We met when I was defending a major corporate client against fraud charges, and she was the prosecutor who almost had me beat. Almost. When she arrives, she'll be bringing the kind of authority that can make arrests happen very quickly." Derek's face went white, then red. "You can't be serious. You're going to have me arrested for disciplining my own wife? That's insane, Megan. You're overreacting to something that happens in marriages all the time." "Happens in marriages all the time," I said, tasting the words, feeling sick. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Patricia jumped in, her voice rising to a near shriek. "This is absolutely ridiculous. Megan, you cannot destroy your own son-in-law over a tiny domestic disagreement. What will people think? What will this do to Isabel's reputation? You're being hysterical." There was that word again. Hysterical. The universal term for dismissing women's legitimate reactions to intolerable situations. I looked at Patricia, really looked at her. The woman was 62 years old, her hands permanently shaking with what I'd always assumed was age, but now recognized as something else entirely. She wore high-necked blouses even in summer. She flinched when men's voices got loud, and she just applauded her son striking my daughter in the face. "How long did Harold hit you?" I asked quietly. Patricia's face crumpled. For just a second, I saw raw pain flash across her features before she smoothed it away, replacing it with that infuriating smile. Harold was a good man who knew how to keep a household running properly. I was blessed to have him for 38 years before the Lord called him home. That's not an answer. I don't owe you any answers, Megan. You with your fancy career and your money and your independence. You don't understand what real marriage looks like. Sometimes love requires discipline. Sometimes wives need guidance. I taught Derek that, and I'm glad I did, because Isabel clearly never learned how to be a proper wife on her own. The pieces were all there now, forming a picture so disturbing I wanted to close my eyes against it. Patricia had spent nearly 4 decades being abused, had normalized it so completely that she'd taught her son to do the same thing, was proud of passing that legacy forward. She genuinely believed she was helping Isabel by encouraging Derek to correct her behavior. Isabel was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to go to her, to hold her like I did when she was small and had nightmares about monsters under the bed. But the real monsters had been sitting at my dinner table for 3 years, and I'd served them roast beef and fine wine while they systematically destroyed my daughter's sense of self. The doorbell rang, sharp and clear. I'd never been so grateful to hear that sound in my life. "That will be Rebecca," I said. "Derek, I strongly suggest you remain seated and keep your hands visible. Patricia, you can leave now, or you can stay and watch what happens next. The choice is yours." I walked to the front door, my heels clicking on the hardwood with each step, and opened it to find Rebecca Hartwell standing there with 2 women in plain clothes who had badges clipped to their belts. Rebecca was 54, impeccably dressed as always, her silver hair cut short and professional. The 2 women with her were younger, 30s maybe, with the particular alertness that came from specialized training. "Megan," Rebecca said, her eyes searching my face, "tell me what happened." So I did. Every detail, while we stood in my foyer, with my voice never rising above conversational level. Rebecca's expression grew darker with each sentence. When I finished, she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Detective Martinez and Detective Chen specialize in domestic violence cases," she said. "They're going to need to document everything and take statements. Are you comfortable with them coming in?" "Yes." "And Isabel? Is she able to talk right now?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think she needs to. I think she's been silent for too long already." Rebecca squeezed my shoulder once, a gesture of friendship and solidarity that almost broke my careful composure. Then she walked into my dining room with the 2 detectives following, and I watched as my son-in-law finally began to understand that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. They'd thought they were dealing with an overprotective mother-in-law, a nuisance to be managed with charm and dismissive words. What they didn't know, what Derek and Patricia couldn't possibly have understood, was that they'd just committed assault in front of a woman who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how to destroy powerful men who thought they were untouchable. They didn't know who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. 8 years ago, I lost the other half of my soul on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Robert collapsed in his office at the firm, massive stroke, gone before the ambulance even arrived. He was 52 years old. We'd been married for 28 years, and I genuinely believed we'd have at least 30 more. The funeral was enormous. Robert had been one of those rare corporate lawyers who everyone actually liked, the kind of man who remembered secretaries' birthdays and mentored young associates without expecting anything in return. I stood there in my black Chanel suit, accepting condolences from what felt like half of Connecticut, and the only thing I could think was that Isabel had lost her father at 24, and I had no idea how to fill that void. Because the truth was, Robert had been the warm one, the present parent, the one who showed up to every school play and parent-teacher conference while I was in depositions or client meetings. I'd built my career with single-minded focus, transforming myself from the first person in my working-class family to attend college into one of the most sought-after strategic consultants on the East Coast. My expertise was turning around failing corporations, negotiating hostile takeovers, and advising Fortune 500 CEOs on crisis management. I was very good at what I did. I was also frequently absent from home. Robert never complained. He'd chosen corporate law specifically because it had more predictable hours than litigation, so one of us could be reliably present for Isabel. He was the one who taught her to ride a bike, who helped with science projects, who sat through every single one of her architecture presentations in college. I showed up when I could, always feeling guilty it wasn't more often, always promising myself I'd cut back on work, eventually. Then he died, and eventually never came. The guilt was crushing. I'd spent decades building an empire, accumulating $12 million in assets, properties in Greenwich and Manhattan, a client roster that read like a who's who of American business. And for what? Robert was gone. All those missed dinners and school events couldn't be reclaimed, and Isabel was left with one parent, the one who'd been too busy to show up half the time. I tried to compensate in the years after his death. I cut my client load by 40%, something I'd never imagined doing. I scheduled regular lunches with Isabel, mother-daughter spa days, shopping trips into the city. But she was an adult by then, building her own career in architecture, establishing her independence. She had her own apartment in Stamford, a growing portfolio of clients, a social life I wasn't really part of. I told myself this was healthy, that respecting her autonomy was the right thing to do after years of being an absent mother. I told myself I was giving her space. Looking back now, I realize I was afraid. Afraid she resented me for all those missed moments. Afraid that trying to be more present now would feel like too little, too late. So I held back, kept my distance, convinced myself that loving her meant letting her live her own life without interference. Derek appeared 4 years ago, right around the time I was finally starting to feel like Isabel and I had found our rhythm. She brought him to Sunday brunch at my house, introduced him as someone she'd met through a client referral. He was 31 then, working as a sales manager at some tech company in Norwalk. Good-looking in that carefully groomed way, expensive haircut, cologne that probably cost more than it should. He had a firm handshake and made eye contact when he spoke, all the markers of confidence. Something about him bothered me immediately. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. He said all the right things, complimented the house, asked intelligent questions about my work, was attentive to Isabel in ways that seemed considerate. But there was something calculated about it all, like he was performing the role of perfect boyfriend rather than actually being one. I pulled Isabel aside that day while Derek was in the bathroom. "How long have you been seeing him?" 3 months, she said, and her face was glowing in a way I hadn't seen since before Robert died. "Mom, I really think this might be it. He's so supportive of my career, and he's already talking about long-term plans, and his family is really traditional, which I think is nice, you know? Like they value commitment in marriage and building something real. Traditional." That should have been my first warning sign. But Isabel looked happy, genuinely happy, and I was so desperate for her to have that happiness after losing her father that I pushed my concerns aside. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe my years in corporate litigation had made me suspicious of everyone. Maybe Derek was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man who loved my daughter. They got engaged after 8 months. Fast, but not unheard of. The wedding was beautiful. A spring ceremony at a vineyard in the Hudson Valley with 200 guests. Derek's family was there, smaller than ours, more conservative in dress and manner. His father had died years earlier, so it was mainly Patricia and some cousins. Patricia had seemed nervous, but pleasant, complimenting everything in a way that felt almost desperate. I remember thinking she was just socially anxious. I gave a speech at the reception about how Robert would have loved Derek, about how grateful I was that Isabel had found someone to build a life with. I meant every word at the time. Derek's speech thanked me for welcoming him into the family, for trusting him with my daughter. He looked at Isabel like she was precious, and I let myself believe everything would be fine. The first year of marriage seemed normal. Isabel and Derek bought a modest house in Darien, nothing extravagant but nice, with good bones and potential for renovation. Isabel threw herself into decorating it, excited to put her architectural training to practical use. They came to Sunday dinners most weeks. Derek was attentive, maybe even slightly overbearing in his attention, but I interpreted that as newlywed enthusiasm. Then small things started changing. Isabel began canceling our lunch dates, always with apologetic texts about Derek needing her for something or having surprise plans. When we did meet, Derek would often show up partway through, joining us uninvited with explanations about being in the neighborhood. She started dressing differently, more conservatively, higher necklines and longer sleeves even in summer heat. Her phone was always face down on the table, and she checked it constantly with this anxious expression. I asked her once if everything was okay. This was about 18 months into the marriage. We were supposed to have lunch at our favorite bistro in Greenwich, but she'd called to reschedule, her voice tight with stress. When I pressed her, she insisted everything was fine. She was just adjusting to married life, learning to balance her career with being a good wife. Being a good wife. Those words should have set off every alarm I had, but I didn't push. I told myself that marriage was an adjustment, that every couple went through periods of finding their balance. I respected her privacy, her independence. I backed off, giving her the space I thought she wanted, the space I'd convinced myself was appropriate, given my history of being an absent mother. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of watching my daughter slowly disappear into herself, while I stood back and did nothing because I was too afraid of being intrusive, too guilty about my past absence, too convinced that respecting her autonomy meant not interfering in her marriage. The professional dinners she used to love attending became obligations she dreaded. Her design portfolio, once constantly updated with new projects, stagnated. She stopped mentioning friends' names. The brightness in her eyes when she talked about architecture dimmed and eventually extinguished. She started second-guessing every professional decision, calling me to ask if I thought she was being unreasonable when clients made requests, wondering if she was charging too much, questioning whether she was actually good at her job. This was a woman who graduated top of her class from Yale's architecture program, a woman who had 3 major design awards before she turned 30. And she was asking me if she was competent enough to negotiate a kitchen renovation. I told myself it was imposter syndrome, something many successful women dealt with. I didn't connect it to Derek. Or maybe I did, somewhere deep down. But I didn't want to see it, because seeing it would mean acknowledging that I'd failed to protect her, that my instincts about him had been right all along, that while I was respecting her independence, she was being systematically destroyed. Patricia started appearing more frequently at family gatherings about a year ago. She'd moved into a small apartment near Derek and Isabel after some issue with her previous housing, something Derek explained vaguely as financial difficulties. She was always there, always watching Isabel with this critical eye, making small comments about housekeeping or cooking or proper behavior. Isabel would smile tightly and take the criticism, adjusting whatever Patricia complained about. I should have said something. I should have told Patricia to back off, should have pulled Isabel aside and demanded the truth. But I didn't. I was the absent mother trying not to be overbearing, the successful career woman who didn't want to impose old-fashioned expectations, the grieving widow who wanted her daughter to have a complete family even if it wasn't the one Robert and I had built. So I said nothing. I watched. I worried quietly. And Derek continued to isolate my daughter piece by piece, while his mother applauded every manipulation as proper wifely behavior. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be a celebration of Patricia's birthday. Derek had called me personally to request hosting it at my house, explaining that their place was too small and Patricia had always admired my home. He was charming on the phone, grateful, emphasizing how much it would mean to his mother. I agreed immediately, pleased that Derek wanted to include me, interpreting it as a sign that maybe things were getting better. Isabel had shown up 3 hours early to prepare everything. She'd brought all the ingredients, insisted on doing all the cooking herself, waved away my offers to help or hire caterers. I'd thought she was being thoughtful, taking the burden off me. Now I understood she'd been terrified of not meeting Derek's standards, of the consequences if dinner wasn't perfect. I'd watched her work in my kitchen for hours, her hands shaking slightly as she seasoned the roast, jumping every time her phone buzzed with what I now realized were Derek's check-in messages. She'd been wearing a long-sleeved silk blouse despite the warm evening, makeup slightly heavier than usual around her jawline. All the signs had been there, every single one. And I'd missed them all because I was too busy respecting her independence to see that she had none left. Rebecca walked into my dining room like she owned it, which in a way, she did. We'd been friends long enough that she knew every corner of this house, had celebrated promotions and mourned losses here, had shared enough wine and conversation to fill volumes. But the woman who entered now wasn't my friend Rebecca. This was Federal Judge Hartwell, and the transformation was immediate and absolute. Detective Martinez was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that took in every detail of the room in seconds. Detective Chen was slightly older, her expression neutral but alert. Both women had the controlled stillness of people trained to handle dangerous situations. Derek had risen from his chair, his face cycling through expressions as he tried to determine the right approach. He landed on indignant confusion. "I don't understand what's happening here. Megan, this is completely unnecessary. Can we please just talk about this like reasonable adults?" "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Detective Martinez said, her voice flat and professional. It wasn't a request. Derek sat. Some of his carefully maintained composure cracked around the edges. Patricia was wringing her hands, the shaking worse than usual. "This is insane. You can't just barge into someone's home and start making demands. We have rights." "Derek has rights. This is harassment." "Actually, ma'am, we're responding to a report of domestic violence," Detective Chen said, pulling out a notebook. "We're here to document the incident and take statements. You're welcome to leave if you're not comfortable with that, but we will need to speak with everyone who was present when the assault occurred." "Assault," Derek repeated, his voice rising slightly. "It wasn't assault. It was a private matter between husband and wife. This is completely blown out of proportion." Rebecca had been standing silently, observing. Now she moved to the empty chair across from Derek and sat down, her posture perfect, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Federal Judge Rebecca Hartwell. I've known Megan Marlowe for 20 years, and I've never known her to exaggerate or misrepresent facts. When she calls me and says she needs authority immediately, I respond. So why don't you tell me exactly what happened here tonight?" Derek's jaw tightened. I could see him calculating, trying to find the angle that would let him control this situation. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is a family matter. My wife and I had a minor disagreement. I may have reacted more strongly than I should have, but it was one isolated incident brought on by extreme stress. I've recently lost my position at work, and the pressure has been overwhelming. Tonight, Isabel was being careless with the dinner service, and I overreacted. That's all. The admission about losing his job was news to me. I glanced at Isabel, who was staring at her hands in her lap, tears still streaming silently down her face. She hadn't known either. I could tell from the way her shoulders tensed. "When did you lose your position?" Rebecca asked, her tone conversational, but her eyes sharp. 4 months ago. "And you didn't tell your wife?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't want to worry her. I've been looking for new opportunities. These things take time in this economy. But you've been letting her believe you were going to work every day for 4 months, Rebecca said. It wasn't a question. "I've been networking, attending interviews. It's all part of the job search process." Detective Martinez had moved closer to Isabel. "Mrs. Sterling, I need you to look at me, please." Her voice was gentle but firm. Isabel slowly raised her head, and even from across the room, I could see the red marks on her face had darkened to deep crimson, the outline of fingers clearly visible. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Isabel's voice was barely a whisper. "I was bringing out the roast. Derek said something about the timing being wrong, that I should have served it 5 minutes earlier. I tried to explain that I'd been following the recipe exactly, but he said I was making excuses. Then he hit me 3 times. Had he hit you before tonight?" The silence stretched out. I watched my daughter's face, saw the war happening behind her eyes. Years of being told to keep quiet, to protect her husband's reputation, to be a good wife, fighting against the desperate need to finally tell someone the truth. "Yes," she whispered. That single word hit me like a physical blow. I'd known it, suspected it, but hearing her confirm it made everything real in a way that was almost unbearable. "How many times?" Detective Martinez asked. "I don't know. It started about 8 months ago. Just once he pushed me into the wall, said it was an accident. Then a few weeks later he grabbed my arm so hard it bruised. After that, it got more frequent. Maybe once a week, sometimes more if he was stressed about something." Derek was on his feet instantly. "That's not true. Isabel, why are you lying? You're making me sound like some kind of monster when you know perfectly well that most of those incidents were accidents. Or you were the one who provoked." "Sit down," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through his protest like ice. "Right now, Mr. Sterling." He sat, but his face was flushed with anger, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Detective Chen was photographing Isabel's face from multiple angles, documenting the marks with professional efficiency. "Mrs. Sterling, are there other injuries? Bruises or marks elsewhere that we should document?" Isabel nodded slowly, then began rolling up her sleeves. I felt sick. Her forearms were covered in bruises at various stages of healing, green and yellow and purple. Distinct finger-shaped marks where someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave lasting damage. There were more on her upper arms, and when Detective Chen asked, Isabel admitted there were others on her ribs and back. I'd like to have a nurse practitioner examine you for a full documentation of injuries, Detective Chen said. Would you be comfortable with that? Yes, Isabel said, and this time her voice was stronger. Patricia had been silent during this exchange, her face growing paler by the second. Now she found her voice, though it was shaking. Derek, tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them how Isabel exaggerates things, how she's always been dramatic. Tell them about how she provokes you, how she doesn't listen when you try to help her improve. Mrs. Sterling, Detective Martinez said, turning to Patricia with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Are you seriously suggesting that this woman deserved to be hit? I'm suggesting that sometimes wives need correction, Patricia said, lifting her chin with something that might have been defiance or might have been desperation. My husband knew how to keep me in line, and I was a better wife for it. Derek learned from the best. If Isabel would just learn to be more obedient, to respect her husband's authority, none of this would be necessary. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Derek looked uncomfortable with his mother's statement, though whether it was because he disagreed or because she'd said the quiet part out loud, I couldn't tell. Rebecca stood up slowly, her movements controlled, but her eyes blazing. Mrs. Sterling, what you just described is called abuse. The fact that you experienced it doesn't make it acceptable. The fact that you're encouraging your son to perpetuate that cycle makes you complicit in his crimes. Crimes, Patricia repeated, her voice rising to a near shriek. How dare you? Derek is a good man, a good husband. He provides for Isabel, he's patient with her shortcomings, he tries to help her be better. If she would just listen, just do what he asks, there wouldn't be any problems. This is all her fault for being so stubborn, so resistant to guidance. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Patricia, listen to yourself. You're describing abuse. You're defending violence. Your son struck my daughter in the face 3 times, hard enough to leave marks that will last for days, and you applauded. You literally clapped your hands and smiled like he'd done something praiseworthy. Because he did. Patricia was fully crying now, her makeup running, her hands shaking violently. He's trying to save his marriage the same way Harold saved ours. Isabel needs to learn. She needs to understand that marriage requires sacrifice, requires submission, requires accepting correction when you fail to meet your husband's needs. How long did Harold abuse you? I asked again, more gently this time despite my rage. Patricia's face crumpled completely. 38 years, she whispered. From the day we married until the day he died, and I was a good wife. I learned to anticipate his needs, to avoid triggering his anger, to accept punishment when I failed. I became the woman he needed me to be. You became a victim, Rebecca said quietly. And instead of getting help, instead of breaking that cycle, you taught your son that violence was love. Do you understand what you've done? Patricia was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. I did what I had to do to survive. I taught Derek what I knew. How else was I supposed to prepare him for marriage? By showing him that violence is never acceptable, I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. By teaching him that women are human beings deserving of respect, not property to be controlled. By breaking the cycle, instead of passing it on like some kind of terrible inheritance. Derek had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice low and dangerous. You all talk about breaking cycles and respect like you understand anything about real relationships. Isabel knew what she was getting into when she married me. She knew my expectations. If she just lived up to them, none of this would have happened. But she's lazy, she's careless, she's constantly disappointing me, despite everything I do to help her improve. Help her improve, I repeated, tasting the words. Is that what you call it when you hit her? Improvement? I call it necessary correction for someone who refuses to learn any other way. You raised her to be independent and stubborn, Megan. You taught her to prioritize career over family, to think she was too good to submit to her husband's authority. I've spent 3 years trying to undo the damage you did, trying to make her into a proper wife, and she fights me at every turn. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, he was the victim here, the long-suffering husband trying to fix a broken wife while dealing with an interfering mother-in-law. The narcissism was so complete, so impenetrable, that I almost couldn't process it. Detective Martinez was writing everything down, her pen moving rapidly across her notebook. Every word Derek said was digging his grave deeper, and he was too arrogant to realize it. Mr. Sterling, Rebecca said, her voice deadly calm, I want to be very clear about something. What you've just described is a pattern of domestic abuse. The physical violence, the emotional manipulation, the financial control, the isolation from friends and family, the systematic destruction of your wife's self-esteem. All of it constitutes criminal behavior. The fact that you believe you were justified makes it worse, not better. I want a lawyer, Derek said abruptly, apparently finally realizing he'd said too much. That's your right, Detective Chen said. But before we go any further, I need to inform you that you're under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent. As she read him his Miranda rights, I watched Derek's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. Patricia was still crying, rocking back and forth in her chair. Isabel sat frozen, watching her husband being arrested with an expression I couldn't quite read. Detective Martinez was on her phone, arranging for the nurse practitioner to come to the house for the medical examination. Rebecca had moved to sit beside Isabel, speaking to her in low, comforting tones. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else's family in someone else's house. Derek stood when Detective Chen told him to, his hands now cuffed behind his back. As they led him toward the door, he looked at Isabel with something that might have been desperation, or might have been rage. Isabel, don't do this. Tell them you're dropping the charges. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. We can work this out at home, just the two of us. Baby, please. Isabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned away, facing the wall instead. I can't, she whispered. I can't do this anymore. You ungrateful bitch, Derek snarled, the mask finally dropping completely. After everything I've done for you, everything I've put up with, this is how you repay me? I should have listened to my mother when she said you weren't worth the effort. You're pathetic, weak, a complete failure as a wife. You're nothing without me. That's enough, Detective Chen said firmly, guiding him toward the door. Let's go, Mr. Sterling. As they left, Patricia tried to follow, still sobbing, still pleading for someone to stop this madness. Detective Martinez gently but firmly directed her to sit back down. Mrs. Sterling, we need to take your statement as well. You were present during the assault, and your response is part of the record. But Derek needs me, Patricia wailed. He needs his mother. He's scared, he's confused, he doesn't understand what's happening. He understands perfectly, I said coldly. He understands that he's facing consequences for the first time in his life. He understands that hitting women isn't consequence-free when there are witnesses who refuse to stay silent. Patricia looked at me with something close to hatred. This is your fault. You and your independence and your career and your money. You never taught Isabel how to be a proper wife. You never showed her that sometimes you have to accept a firm hand for your own good. If you'd raised her right, none of this would have happened. If I'd raised her right, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm, she would have left him the first time he laid a hand on her. If I'd raised her right, she would have known that no amount of love or commitment justifies violence. But I didn't teach her that, did I? I taught her to respect her partner's autonomy, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to try to work through problems. I taught her to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. And Derek took advantage of every single one of those lessons to destroy her piece by piece. Isabel was crying again, harder now, her whole body shaking with sobs. Rebecca held her, letting her break down completely, murmuring reassurances that she was safe now, that everything was going to be okay. But was it? I looked at my daughter, at the bruises covering her arms, at the red marks on her face, at the way she held herself like something fragile that might shatter at any moment. And I wondered how long it would take to undo 3 years of systematic abuse. How long before she stopped flinching at sudden movements? How long before she stopped second-guessing every decision? How long before she believed she was worth more than Derek had convinced her she was? The nurse practitioner arrived 30 minutes later, a calm woman in her 40s who'd clearly handled these situations before. She set up a private area in my study to conduct the examination, while Detective Martinez took Patricia's statement in the dining room. I heard fragments of it, Patricia still insisting that Derek was a good man, that Isabel had provoked him, that this was all blown out of proportion. Rebecca and I sat in the living room, not speaking, just being present. After 20 years of friendship, we didn't always need words. She'd seen the worst of humanity in her courtroom, had heard testimony about violence and cruelty that would break most people. But this was different. This was personal. This was my daughter. I should have known, I said finally, my voice barely audible. All the signs were there. I should have pushed harder, asked more questions, refused to accept her excuses. You trusted her to tell you if something was wrong, Rebecca said. That's not a failure, Megan. That's respecting her agency. But she couldn't tell me. He'd isolated her so completely that she probably didn't even have the words anymore. And I just stepped back and let it happen because I was too afraid of being an overbearing mother, too guilty about my past absence to risk pushing her away by interfering. Abusers are experts at manipulation, Rebecca said gently. They know exactly which buttons to push, which fears to exploit. Derek knew about your guilt, about your history of prioritizing career over family time. He used that against both of you. I'm going to destroy him, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. I'm going to use every connection I have, every favor owed, every bit of influence I've accumulated over 30 years, and I'm going to make sure he faces consequences for every single thing he did to her. Rebecca smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. I know you will, and I'll help. The nurse practitioner emerged from my study 45 minutes later, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learn to mask their reactions to terrible things. She spoke briefly with Detective Martinez, showed her the documentation she'd compiled, and I caught glimpses of photographs on her tablet that made my stomach turn. Isabel followed behind her, moving slowly like someone who'd been hollowed out from the inside. 32 distinct bruises and contusions, the nurse said quietly to Rebecca and me after the detectives had what they needed. Various stages of healing. The oldest are approximately 2 months old, several cracked ribs that healed incorrectly, probably from an incident about 6 weeks ago. Defensive wounds on her forearms, consistent with trying to block strikes. And those are just the physical injuries I can document. 32. I tried to process that number and couldn't. 32 times my daughter had been hurt badly enough to leave marks, and I'd never known, never seen, never pushed hard enough past her excuses to discover the truth. Isabel sat down on the couch beside me, moving gingerly. Everything made horrible sense now. The careful way she'd been carrying herself, the long sleeves in summer, the way she'd stopped wearing the sleeveless dresses she used to love. She'd been hiding a war zone underneath her clothes while I complained about Sunday lunch cancellations. Mom, she said, her voice small and broken, there's something else I need to tell you. I took her hand, careful of the bruises on her wrist. Whatever it is, we'll handle it. She took a shaky breath. I'm pregnant. 6 weeks. The world tilted slightly. Pregnant. My daughter was carrying a child while being systematically beaten by the father. The implications crashed over me like a wave. What if she'd lost the baby from one of his attacks? What if he'd hit her in the stomach? What if the pregnancy had escalated his violence further? Does Derek know? Rebecca asked, her voice carefully controlled. Isabel shook her head. I just found out 3 days ago. I was trying to figure out how to tell him. I was terrified of how he'd react. Part of me thought maybe a baby would make him better, make him want to change. But the other part, she broke down again, sobs racking her body. The other part knew it would make everything worse. He'd use the baby to control me even more. I'd never be able to leave. I'd be trapped forever. I pulled her close, letting her cry against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small and the world felt too big. You're not trapped. Not anymore. He's never going to hurt you again, sweetheart. I promise you that. He'll get out, though, she whispered. Maybe not tonight, but eventually. He'll make bail, and he'll come after me. He told me once that if I ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure I regretted it. He knows people, Mom. He knows lawyers. His uncle is some big-shot attorney in New York who's gotten him out of trouble before. Rebecca's expression hardened. Let me worry about the legal aspects. I've been a federal judge for 8 years, Megan's been destroying powerful men in courtrooms for 3 decades, and we have documentation of abuse that would make any prosecutor salivate. Derek Sterling isn't going to get away with this. Detective Martinez had finished with Patricia's statement and sent her home in an Uber, much to the older woman's distress. Now she came over to us, her notebook still in hand. Mrs. Sterling, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has Derek ever threatened to kill you? Isabel went very still. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Yes, she finally whispered. 3 times. Once when I suggested marriage counseling. Once when he found out I'd had lunch with an old friend from college without telling him first. And once last month when I said I wanted to go back to working full-time instead of just taking on small projects from home. What exactly did he say? The last time, he told me that if I ever tried to leave him, if I ever embarrassed him publicly or damaged his reputation, he'd make sure I didn't live to regret it. He said accidents happen all the time, especially to women who don't know their place. He said it while he had his hand around my throat. Detective Martinez wrote that down with the clinical precision of someone who'd heard similar statements too many times before. Did he ever show you weapons? Guns? Knives? He has a handgun. A Glock, I think. He keeps it in a lockbox in our bedroom closet. He made me watch him load it once, said he wanted me to understand what he was capable of if I ever pushed him too far. I felt cold all over. This wasn't just abuse. This was domestic terrorism. Derek had been systematically using fear and violence to control my daughter, and he'd been escalating. The threat of murder wasn't hyperbole. It was a promise. We need to get a restraining order immediately, Rebecca said, already pulling out her phone. Emergency protective order tonight. Full order by Monday morning. Isabel, you can't go back to that house. I don't want to, Isabel said quickly. I never want to see that place again. But all my things are there. My design portfolio, my clothes, my mother's jewelry that Dad gave me before he died. We can arrange a police escort to retrieve your belongings, Detective Martinez said. But Judge Hartwell is right. You can't go back there alone, and honestly, I'd recommend you don't go back at all. We can have officers collect your essential items. You'll stay here, I said firmly. This is your home, Isabel. It always has been. Your room is exactly as you left it when you moved out. We'll get your things from the house, and we'll make sure Derek never comes near you again. She looked at me with eyes that were so much older than they'd been a few hours ago. What about the baby? I can't raise a child alone, Mom. I can't afford to stop working, and Derek controlled all our finances. I don't even know how much money I have anymore. He made me put everything from Dad's inheritance into joint accounts, and he's the only one with access. Then we'll get it back, I said. Every penny. And you're not alone. You have me. You have this house. You have resources that Derek never wanted you to remember you had. Your father left you $300,000, and we're going to make damn sure you get it back, plus whatever assets were acquired during the marriage. Rebecca was nodding. Financial abuse is part of the case. We'll subpoena the bank records, trace every transaction. If he's been stealing from you, that's another charge. If he's been hiding assets, that's another charge. We're going to build a case so airtight that no uncle in New York, no matter how connected, can make it go away. Isabel leaned against me, exhausted. I should have told you sooner. I should have said something the first time he hit me. But I was so ashamed. I kept thinking it was my fault, that I'd provoked him, that if I just tried harder to be what he wanted, he'd stop. And Patricia kept telling me that marriage was supposed to be hard, that I needed to be more submissive, more accommodating. I started believing I was the problem. You were never the problem, I said fiercely. Derek is an abuser. That's who he is at his core. Nothing you could have done would have changed that. You could have been perfect in every way, and he still would have found reasons to hurt you because the violence was never about you. It was about his need for control. She nodded slowly, like she was trying to absorb that truth, trying to believe it after 3 years of being told she was the reason for her own abuse. My phone buzzed. A text from Detective Chen. Sterling made bail, $50K. He's out. Restraining order being expedited. I showed it to Rebecca, whose expression went granite hard. That was faster than I expected. His uncle must have made calls. He's out? Isabel's voice was pure panic. Already? He's going to come here, Mom. He's not going to do anything, I said, with more confidence than I felt. The restraining order means he can't come within 500 feet of you. If he violates it, he goes right back to jail. But we all knew restraining orders were paper shields. They worked for people who cared about consequences. Derek had just been arrested and released in the same night. He was probably furious, humiliated, and dangerous. I made a decision. Rebecca, I need another favor. She looked at me, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She knew what I was going to ask before I said it. I need to know everything about Derek Sterling, everything he's ever done, everyone he's ever hurt, every skeleton in every closet, and I need it fast. Rebecca smiled, and it was the smile I'd seen her wear in court when she knew she had a defendant cornered. Consider it done. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in strategic warfare, the kind I'd been waging in boardrooms for 3 decades, but had never imagined deploying for something this personal. I made calls. So many calls. Every favor I'd accumulated, every connection I'd cultivated, every ally I'd helped over the years. I activated all of them with surgical precision. Rebecca started with the legal research, and what she found was damning. Derek had a history. 6 years ago, when he was 29, an ex-girlfriend named Amanda Chen had filed a police report against him for assault. She'd shown up at the station with a black eye and bruises around her throat, claiming Derek had attacked her when she tried to end their relationship. The case had been dropped 3 weeks later after Amanda suddenly recanted her statement and moved out of state. Rebecca tracked her down in Seattle, and after some gentle persuasion, Amanda agreed to talk. "He threatened my family," Amanda told me over the phone, her voice still carrying the tremor of old fear. "He said if I didn't drop the charges, accidents would happen. My little sister was in high school at the time. He knew where she went to school, what time she got out, what route she walked home. He never said it explicitly, but the implication was clear, so I dropped it and ran as far as I could." "Would you be willing to testify now?" I asked. "With protection? With support?" There was a long pause. "If it would help keep another woman safe from him, yes. I've carried the guilt of not stopping him for 6 years. If my testimony can help, I'll do it." That was one. Rebecca's investigator found 2 more. A woman Derek had dated in college who'd filed a complaint with campus security about his controlling behavior and verbal abuse. Another ex-girlfriend who'd gotten a restraining order against him 4 years ago, which he'd violated twice before she moved to California and he moved on to his next target. A pattern. Clear, documented, undeniable. Derek Sterling was a serial abuser who'd been refining his techniques for over a decade. And Isabel was just the latest victim who'd stayed long enough for the violence to escalate to this level. But the most devastating discovery came from my own investigation into his finances. I'd hired a forensic accountant, someone I'd used in corporate fraud cases, to examine the joint accounts Derek had forced Isabel to create. What we found was systematic theft. Over 3 years of marriage, Derek had siphoned nearly $200,000 from Isabel's inheritance, her father's legacy, and funneled it into accounts under his mother's name, offshore investment vehicles, and cash withdrawals that left no trail. He'd been planning his exit strategy, or more likely, planning to leave Isabel with nothing if she ever tried to leave him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He'd been stealing from her while beating her, all while making her believe she was the problem. I was in my home office reviewing these documents when Isabel appeared in the doorway. It was 2 a.m, and neither of us could sleep. She was wearing one of my old Yale sweatshirts, looking younger and more fragile than I'd seen her since childhood. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. "Too much rage," I admitted. "Come sit with me." She settled into the leather chair across from my desk, curling her legs underneath her. The bruises on her face had darkened to deep purple, spreading like storm clouds across her cheekbone and jaw. Looking at them made me want to find Derek and return every mark he'd left on her body with interest. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about the baby, about what kind of life I can give it. What if Derek gets partial custody? What if he uses the baby to control me, the way he controlled everything else? I can't let my child grow up watching what I went through. I can't let them learn that love looks like fear." "He's not getting custody," I said firmly. "Rebecca is already building that case. The documented abuse, the threats, the financial theft, the pattern of violence with previous partners. No judge is going to give him access to a child. But he'll try. You know he will. He'll paint me as an unfit mother, as mentally unstable, as someone who alienated him from his own child. He's good at manipulation, Mom. He's so good at making people believe his version of reality. Then we'll be better, I said. We'll be so prepared, so thorough, so undeniably factual that his manipulation won't work. I've spent 30 years destroying men who thought they were untouchable. Derek Sterling is not special. He's not smarter than me. He's not more connected than me. And he sure as hell doesn't have the resources I do. She smiled slightly. The first real smile I'd seen since that horrible dinner. You're terrifying when you're protective, you know that? Good. I should have been terrifying 3 years ago. I should have trusted my instincts about him from the beginning. I wouldn't have listened, she said honestly. I was so desperate for the kind of family Dad and I had, for that feeling of being part of something solid and traditional. Derek presented himself as the answer to that. By the time I realized what he really was, I was already trapped. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of lost time heavy between us. I found something today, Isabel said finally. Patricia sent me an email. Want to hear it? I nodded, bracing myself. Isabel pulled out her phone and read aloud. Dear Isabel, I've been thinking about everything that happened, about what that judge said, about cycles and abuse and complicity. I haven't been able to sleep. I keep seeing your face when Derek hit you, and instead of remembering my approval, I'm remembering every time Harold hit me, every time I made excuses for him, every time I told myself I deserved it. I taught Derek that violence was normal. I taught him that women were property to be controlled. I did to him what Harold did to me. I passed on the poison. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm starting therapy tomorrow. There's a group for domestic violence survivors, and they said I could join even though my abuser is dead. I'm doing this because I need to understand what I did, what I enabled, and because I need to make sure I never applaud violence again. I'm so sorry, Isabel. I'm sorry for every time I told you to accept Derek's corrections. I'm sorry for clapping when he hurt you. I'm sorry for trying to make you into the victim I was instead of the survivor you can be. Patricia. I sat back, genuinely surprised. That's remarkably self-aware for someone who was defending him 72 hours ago. Rebecca scared her, Isabel said. Not just with legal threats, but with the truth. Sometimes the truth is more terrifying than consequences. My phone rang. Rebecca, at 2 a.m, which meant news. I answered on speaker. Derek filed a counterpetition, she said without preamble. He's claiming Isabel is mentally unstable, that she has a history of self-harm, that the bruises were from her hurting herself and trying to frame him. His uncle's firm is representing him, and they're going aggressive. They've subpoenaed Isabel's medical records, her therapy notes, everything. Isabel had gone pale. I did see a therapist, she whispered. 6 months ago. For 2 sessions. Derek found out and made me stop. Said it made him look bad if people knew his wife needed mental help. What if they twist what I told her? What if they make me look crazy? They won't, Rebecca said firmly. Because I've already spoken with your therapist, Dr. Sarah Winters, and with your permission, she's willing to testify. Her notes document classic signs of domestic abuse: anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, self-blame. She noted concerns about your safety, even though you didn't disclose violence explicitly. Her professional opinion will eviscerate any claim that you're unstable. What about Derek's job loss? I asked. Can we use that? Already on it. He was fired for aggressive behavior toward female colleagues. 3 separate HR complaints about verbal abuse and intimidation. His employer is willing to provide records as long as we subpoena them so they're legally covered. It corroborates the pattern of violence toward women. Good, I said. What else? The prosecutor handling the criminal case is Maria Gonzalez. She's young, hungry, and she has a personal history with domestic violence cases. Her sister was killed by an abusive ex-husband 5 years ago. When I showed her the file we've compiled, she nearly wept. She's charging Derek with assault and battery, making terroristic threats, financial abuse, and she's exploring stalking charges based on his monitoring of Isabel's phone and movements. Will he take a plea? Isabel asked, her voice small. His lawyers are already reaching out. They want to negotiate down to anger management classes and probation. Maria laughed in their faces and told them she's seeking prison time. Pride surged through me. That's my girl. Not your girl yet, but we're building to it. There's something else, Megan. Derek violated the restraining order this afternoon. Ice water in my veins. What happened? He drove past the house 3 times. Officers stationed outside documented it. He didn't stop, didn't get out, but the order specifies he can't come within 500 feet of the property. He was arrested again 2 hours ago. Bail was set at $200,000 this time, and his uncle is scrambling to get it together. Let him scramble, I said coldly. Every violation builds our case. Every stupid decision he makes proves what we've been saying, that he's dangerous, that he can't control himself, that Isabel needs protection. There's more, Rebecca continued. I pulled some strings with a colleague who handles family court cases. The custody issue Isabel is worried about? We can file for an emergency order terminating Derek's parental rights before the baby is even born, based on documented abuse and threats. It's rare, but with this much evidence, we have a shot. Isabel's hand flew to her stomach, protective. Can we really do that? Can we make sure he never has access to my baby? We can try, and with what we have, I think we'll succeed. But Isabel, you need to be prepared for him to fight dirty. He's going to say terrible things about you. He's going to try to destroy your reputation the way he destroyed your self-esteem. Are you ready for that? Isabel looked at me, then back at the phone. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than I'd heard it in years. I'm ready. I'm done being afraid of him. I'm done letting him control my life. If he wants a war, he picked the wrong family. Pride swelled in my chest so intensely, it was almost painful. There was my daughter. There was Robert's daughter. There was the woman she'd been before Derek systematically tried to erase her. Then we go to war, I said. Rebecca, what do you need from me? Keep doing what you're doing. Keep finding evidence. Keep building the case. I'll handle the legal strategy. Maria will handle criminal prosecution. You just focus on supporting Isabel and making Derek's life a living hell through entirely legal channels. Done, I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. After we hung up, Isabel and I sat in the quiet of my office, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark the passing hours. Outside, I could see the unmarked police car stationed at the end of my driveway, a silent guardian against the monster who thought he could still control my daughter's life. Mom, Isabel said finally, at that dinner, when you stood up and made that phone call, Derek looked so confused, like he couldn't understand what was happening. He genuinely thought you'd just accept it, maybe give him a stern talking to and send us home. He had no idea what was coming. He underestimated you, I said. He thought because he'd isolated you, because he'd convinced you that you were weak and worthless, that you'd stay isolated forever. He didn't account for the fact that you have a mother who spent 3 decades learning how to destroy powerful men who abuse their authority. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Neither did I, honestly, she said with a slight smile. I forgot what you were like in work mode. I forgot that before you were my mom who felt guilty about missing school events, you were the woman who made Fortune 500 CEOs nervous. The woman Dad used to joke could negotiate with terrorists and come out with their lunch money. I laughed despite everything, remembering Robert saying exactly that after I'd closed a particularly brutal corporate merger. Your father always said I was terrifying in heels and a power suit. You are, Isabel said, but you're also my mom. And right now, I need both versions of you. I need the terrifying corporate warrior and the mother who held me when I had nightmares. Can you be both? I stood up, moved around the desk, and pulled her into my arms. Sweetheart, I will be whatever you need me to be. And what you need right now is someone who will fight for you with everything she has while making sure you feel safe and loved. I can do that. I should have been doing it all along. She cried against my shoulder, the kind of deep, cleansing sobs that come when someone finally feels safe enough to break. I held her and planned my next moves, the lawyer and the mother working in perfect synchronization for the first time in years. Derek Sterling had made the mistake of hurting my daughter in front of me. He'd made the mistake of thinking his charm and his uncle's law firm and his mother's enablement would be enough to escape consequences. He'd made the catastrophic error of underestimating exactly how far a mother would go to protect her child when that mother had spent 30 years accumulating the power, connections, and resources to wage total war. He was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. And I was going to enjoy every minute of teaching it to him. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what used to be Isabel's childhood bedroom and watched my daughter nurse my granddaughter for the first time. Sophie Eleanor Marlowe, named after Robert's mother and mine, had been born at 6:42 in the morning after 14 hours of labor that I'd witnessed from start to finish. She was perfect. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of absolute perfection, with Robert's nose and Isabel's eyes. Derek had tried to be there. Even from behind bars, he'd filed emergency motions demanding to be present at the birth, claiming parental rights. Rebecca had buried those motions so thoroughly that his lawyers stopped trying after the third rejection. The judge, not Rebecca, to avoid any appearance of bias, but one of her colleagues who'd reviewed the complete case file, had issued a preliminary order terminating Derek's parental rights pending the final hearing. The order cited documented abuse, credible threats of violence, financial exploitation, and expert testimony that his presence would pose a danger to both mother and child. The criminal trial had been devastating for Derek in the most satisfying way possible. Maria Gonzalez had prosecuted with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a crusader. Amanda Chen had testified, her voice steady as she described Derek's threats against her family. 2 other ex-girlfriends had come forward with similar stories. The HR complaints from his former employer painted a picture of escalating aggression. Isabel's testimony had been the final nail, 3 hours of detailed, documented horror that left the jury visibly shaken. Derek's uncle had tried everything. Character witnesses who swore Derek was a good man under stress. Expert psychologists who claimed he had anger issues that could be managed with treatment. Implications that Isabel was vindictive, that she'd provoked him, that the pregnancy was a manipulation tactic. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, too well documented, too damning. 2 years in state prison, plus 3 years of probation after release. Mandatory domestic violence intervention programming. Lifetime restraining order barring contact with Isabel or Sophie. Complete termination of parental rights. Restitution of $197,000 stolen from Isabel's inheritance, plus interest and penalties. The judge had called it one of the clearest cases of domestic abuse she'd seen in 20 years on the bench. Patricia had attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row, crying silently. She never tried to approach Isabel, never attempted to defend Derek on the stand when the prosecution called her as a witness. Her testimony had been devastating in its honesty. Yes, she'd encouraged Derek's violence. Yes, she'd taught him that controlling women was appropriate. Yes, she'd applauded when he struck Isabel, because that's what she'd learned to do during 38 years of her own abuse. The prosecutor could have charged her as an accessory, but Maria had consulted with Isabel first, and my daughter had made the difficult choice to show mercy. Patricia was a victim who'd become an enabler, and charging her wouldn't undo the damage or help her break the cycle. Instead, Isabel had written a victim impact statement that addressed Patricia directly, offering forgiveness contingent on continued therapy and a commitment to never enable abuse again. Patricia had sent letters, 1 a month for the past 6 months, updating Isabel on her progress in therapy, sharing insights she'd gained about the cycle of violence, apologizing in increasingly articulate ways for the harm she'd caused. Isabel read them all, but hadn't responded yet. Maybe someday she would. Maybe someday they'd have some kind of relationship. But not today. Today was for new beginnings, not reconciling with the past. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Isabel murmured, gazing down at Sophie with the kind of love that transcended language. "She's perfect," I agreed, settling into the rocking chair beside the bed, just like her mother. "I can't believe how scared I was 6 months ago," Isabel said softly. "I genuinely thought Derek would find a way to win, to take her from me, to use her as another tool of control. I underestimated you." "You underestimated yourself," I corrected gently. "You're the one who testified for 3 hours with every eye in that courtroom on you. You're the one who contacted Derek's other victims and convinced them they'd be safe coming forward. You're the one who rebuilt your life while pregnant and traumatized. I just made some phone calls and paid some lawyers." She laughed softly. "You did a bit more than that, Mom. You demolished him, systematically, strategically, thoroughly. Dad would have been proud of you." The mention of Robert brought the familiar ache, but it was gentler now, mixed with gratitude. Your father would have been proud of both of us, and he would have absolutely adored Sophie. We sat in comfortable silence, watching Sophie sleep after finishing her feeding. Through the window, I could see the gardens Robert and I had planted 25 years ago, mature now and beautiful in the early spring sunlight. The house felt full again in a way it hadn't since he died. Not just with people, but with purpose, with the sound of new life, with hope for the future. Isabel's architectural firm was thriving. She'd thrown herself back into work during the pregnancy, rediscovering the passion and talent Derek had spent 3 years trying to extinguish. She'd won 2 major design awards in the past 4 months, and her calendar was booked solid for the next year. She'd hired an assistant, joined a support group for domestic violence survivors, started seeing Dr. Winters regularly again. The transformation was remarkable. My daughter was returning to herself, stronger and wiser for the trauma she'd survived. "I've been thinking about something," Isabel said, still gazing at Sophie. "About breaking cycles. Patricia broke hers by getting help, by acknowledging what she'd done wrong. I'm breaking mine by making sure Sophie never sees violence normalized, never learns that love and fear are the same thing. But there are so many other women out there still trapped, still believing they deserve the abuse, still too scared or isolated to reach out." "What are you thinking?" I asked, though I already had an idea where this was going. "A foundation," she said. "Using some of Dad's inheritance that we recovered, and maybe some of my settlement money from Derek. Something that helps women escape abusive situations, provides legal support, connects them with resources, funds safe housing. Something that would have helped me if I'd been brave enough to ask for help sooner." Pride bloomed in my chest, fierce and warm. "I think that's a beautiful idea. And I'd like to contribute as well if you'd let me. We could call it the Robert Marlowe Foundation for Survivors." Her eyes filled with tears, the good kind this time. He would have loved that. He always said the best revenge against injustice was building something better in its place. "He was a wise man," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "And he raised an incredible daughter." Sophie stirred in Isabel's arms, making the tiny mewling sounds that newborns make. My daughter adjusted her hold with the natural grace of new mothers everywhere, and I marveled at the resilience of the human spirit. 6 months ago, this woman had been so broken she could barely imagine a future. Now she was planning to help other survivors while nurturing new life. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Final hearing scheduled for next month. Derek's team is trying one last appeal on parental rights. Don't worry, we've got this. Come have coffee this week?" I showed the text to Isabel, who read it without flinching. "Let him try," she said calmly. "Let him waste his uncle's money and his prison commissary time filing motions. Sophie is mine. This family is mine. My future is mine. He already lost everything that matters. The appeals are just noise." That was my girl. Not the broken victim from that horrible dinner, but the survivor who'd walked through fire and emerged tempered into something stronger than before. "You know what the best part is?" Isabel said, looking up at me with clear eyes. "At that dinner, when Derek hit me and Patricia applauded, I felt completely helpless. I genuinely believed that was just my life now, that I'd have to accept it forever because fighting back was impossible. Then you stood up, made that phone call, and everything changed in minutes. You showed me that I wasn't powerless. I had resources I'd forgotten about. I had a mother who would go to war for me. I had options I couldn't see because Derek had spent 3 years convincing me they didn't exist." "You always had power," I said firmly. "Derek just made you forget it for a while. All I did was remind you." "You did more than that," she insisted. "You taught me that being strong doesn't mean never being vulnerable or never needing help. It means knowing when to reach out, when to fight, and when to let people who love you fight alongside you. That's the lesson I want Sophie to learn. Not that she needs to be invulnerable, but that she's never truly alone." Sophie chose that moment to open her eyes, deep blue, like all newborns, though they'd probably change color in the coming months. She looked at her mother, then at me, with the unfocused gaze of someone brand new to the world, a world where she'd grow up safe, loved, and taught that violence was never acceptable, that love never came with bruises, that strength meant protecting yourself and others from harm. I thought about Derek in his prison cell, probably still believing he was the victim in this story, probably still thinking that if everyone would just listen to his version of events, they'd understand he'd been right all along. The narcissism would never fully leave him, but at least it was contained now. At least he couldn't hurt anyone else while he served his time. And I thought about that dinner 6 months ago, about the moment I stood up and made that phone call, about Derek and Patricia's confusion when they realized they'd underestimated the quiet woman at the head of the table. They'd thought they were dealing with an aging mother-in-law, someone to be managed and placated and dismissed. They hadn't known they were dealing with a woman who'd spent 30 years learning how to destroy powerful men. They hadn't known about the federal judge who'd been my closest friend for 2 decades. They hadn't known about the network of allies and resources and strategic expertise I'd accumulated over a lifetime in corporate warfare. They hadn't known who they were dealing with, but now they did. And so did every other abuser who might think twice before raising a hand, knowing that somewhere out there was a mother who would move heaven and earth to protect her daughter, a survivor who refused to be silenced, and a tiny baby girl who would grow up learning that love meant safety, not fear. "Welcome to the family, Sophie," I whispered, reaching out to touch her impossibly small hand. "You have no idea how many people fought to make sure you'd be born into a world of love instead of violence. Your mother is a warrior, your grandmother is a warrior, and someday you'll be a warrior too. But not because you'll have to fight for your life, because you'll choose to fight for others who can't fight for themselves." Isabel smiled through happy tears. I liked the sound of that. So did I. After everything we'd been through, after all the pain and fear and rage and determination, we'd arrived at something better. Not perfect. Trauma doesn't work that way. But better, safer, stronger. And that was enough.